We are about to start. We are about to start, ladies and gentlemen. Please take your seats. May I kindly ask you to take your seats? We are already behind schedule. If we can get started in a minute. Thank you. Plenty of seats in the front. Let's settle down and get going. We've got a short program, but very intense, so the sooner we get started, the better. I'll just count to 20 and then start. Or call you by name. Thank you. Everybody settled? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ridi Tlabi, and I am your moderator for this special event with the public sector. I must say that I come from a country where the public sector, the private sector, feels that it gets bashed a lot. And yet, it is very active in closing the financial gaps and stepping in when the government fails. And there are so many socio-economic challenges where I come from in South Africa that we often look to the private sector to fill in those gaps. So I come here with a spirit of optimism about the potential of the private sector. But having said that, it is so important that we measure and judge the private sector according to the targets that it has set for itself. Before we get going with our discussion, I think let me remind this audience that credible research is telling us that we are not, and I mean you, the private sector, on target to meet the 2030 SDGs agenda from an environment point of view, human rights, health, and well-being. There are so many statistics that we need to reckon with this afternoon, but the one that stood out for me, and perhaps it stands out because I have seen the impact that school feeding schemes have had on children in my community when I was a child. Perhaps this one resonates with me because I know that I wouldn't be half the person I was if I had not had access to healthy and nutritious meals. Perhaps this statistic stands out for me because I'm a mother of 2 little girls, and I know that their development would be truncated if they did not have access to healthy and nutritious meals. It is an indictment, ladies and gentlemen, that the statistics are telling us that 69% of the largest food producers globally are not meeting the healthy standards, that 80% have no strategy or statement on improving accessibility and affordability of nutritious meals. So we do need to reckon with these statistics. We do need to energize ourselves and commit ourselves to the targets that we set, keeping in mind that the current business models are not sustainable. They are not sustainable. They will impact your profits, they will impact climate change, and they impact the well-being of citizens all over the world. So with that in mind, I hope we will have a robust and honest conversation about where the gaps are, where the weaknesses are, and recommit ourselves to achieving SDGs. Before we start, we want this to be an interactive session. I am notorious for being a technophobe. Every time I press something, it doesn't work. So if I can do it, you can do it. There is a QR code. Put your phone next to it. Just take a shot of it, because I've got some questions that I'd love for you to answer. It's the Mentimeter tool, with which I'm assured you are familiar. Here's my first question. What's the percentage of top food businesses with climate targets aligned with the Paris Agreement? You've got several options, multiple choice. A, less than 10%, B, 30%, C, between 30% and 50%, D, more than 50%. You've got the question. What's your answer? All right. So many of you are saying less than 10%, right? I hope I'm saying this correctly because I failed statistics 4 times at university. So, true story. So many of you are saying less than 10%. We'll find out what the answer is. I've got a second question for you before we get started. The costs to human life due to unhealthy diets is estimated at $11 trillion US. How many deaths worldwide are attributable to unhealthy diets every year? 1 million, B, 2 million, C, 3 million, D, 11 million. Let me see how you're voting. Okay, so 11 million is getting the most votes with my favorite color, pink. How many deaths worldwide are attributed to unhealthy diets every year? Many of you are saying 11 million. Okay, here are the answers. Here are the answers. The answer to question A, what's the percentage of top food businesses with climate targets aligned with the Paris Agreement? The answer is A, less than 10%. To the second question, the cost to human life due to unhealthy diets estimated at $11 trillion. How many deaths worldwide attributable to unhealthy diets every year? The answer, 11 million. So that's correct. So that's it, right? I would like at this moment to help us speak through these outcomes, Victoria de Bourbon de Palme, Food Transformation Lead, WBA, to talk to us about the outcomes. I think you're slightly taller than me, so let's go.
Thank you very much for this brilliant way of introducing us to the session here today. This is one of the only private sector sessions, so I want to start off with elaborating on other statistics. Can everybody who represents the private sector raise their hand? Well done. Good, good. Good to see that. It's important that the private sector is here because global food systems have a tremendous potential to support the 2030 agenda, the Paris Agreement, and of course the Global Biodiversity Framework, just to name a few. However, to realize this potential, we need to ensure that all system stakeholders are on track to contributing to healthy, sustainable, resilient, and equitable food systems. Actions and investments have to be transformative, and every stakeholder has a role to play, especially the private sector, considering its degree of influence on agricultural practices and what ends up on people's plates. While SMEs represent 90% of businesses worldwide, a small number of companies with revenues exceeding certain countries' GDPs dominate food systems. A few examples: 5 companies process and trade almost all the palm oil in the world. A handful of companies control 90% of the grain trade globally. We know that grain trade is a big topic these days, unfortunately. And 6 companies provide the majority of seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides across the world. The good news is that evidence shows that SMEs, as well as certain multinational corporations from across the value chain, are integrating sustainability across their business operations and their supply chains, especially on topics like improving soil health, reducing food loss and waste, and improving farmer resilience. Many of those leading companies, I expect, are here in the room with us today. The bad news is, however, that the vast majority of companies are not on track, and they are not here in the room, I assume. They are lagging behind, and evidence shows that research from the 350 largest multinationals in the world represent over half of global revenue. That's $8.7 trillion. So progress is seen, but doesn't match the level of ambition needed. And this, of course, affects us all. We've seen it from the statistics mentioned earlier. Unhealthy diets attribute to 11 million costs. AFOLU costs, so agriculture, forest, and other land use, contribute to incredible environmental costs of up to $7 trillion. 56% of agriculture finance institutions agree that climate change will negatively impact their clients' financial performance. But I believe we need to speak beyond numbers. More important than numbers is the fact that food is of existential importance to human life. It represents our culture, it flows through our DNA. We need it to thrive and to live. We increasingly depend on the private sector for our food and need to accelerate momentum with scalable action. That can be done through collaboration. Collaboration by the private sector with governments and development partners is crucial for such acceleration. And investments are a very important lever in this. And while there is a need for transparency and accountability, we also need financial mechanisms that support the transition. SMEs are experiencing a $160 billion financial gap between their needs and the capital currently being invested in them. While 90% of smallholder farmers do not have access to formal finance, despite constituting a large majority of the global farming population. Finance can unlock this transformation across the value chain and create responsible investments towards SMEs and farmers. We need increased investments. They are estimated that the needs are between $300 and $350 billion annually over the next decade to ensure that our food systems are fit for purpose. So therefore, the stakeholders in this room must work together to increase the absolute amount of capital invested in food systems and the share of sustainable investments going into the sector. Commitments should demonstrate the quality of impact and contribute to food systems transformation at global level as well as on country level. The global community here in Rome must be clear on what is expected from the private sector when we speak about sustainable food systems transformation. At the same time, governments, investors, and consumers can help accelerate this transition by encouraging good behavior and rewarding those that progress as needed while denouncing actions that hinder this very transformation. That is what corporate accountability really looks like. It is a process in which every stakeholder participates to accelerate positive change. And all of us in this room here today have a responsibility to ensure this and to engage in the tough dialogues, even with the companies that do not perform up to standards. If we only speak to the companies that perform well, or if we only invite the companies that perform well, we will not realize significant improvement and change. It's only through multi-stakeholder, multi-industry discussions that we can lead the way forward towards a prosperous future where people, nature, and production thrive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria, and for reminding us of what true partnerships are about. It's also about talking to people with whom we disagree or who don't have the same priorities, and to persuade each other and collaborate. Now, I'd like to welcome Deanne Holdorf, Executive Vice President, World Business Council for Sustainable Development.
Hello, everyone. It is powerful to see this group coming together in the second UN Food Systems Summit as we do this stock take, because so much of the conversation this week appropriately has been focused on countries, the country pathways, and the country action. But as Victoria so clearly outlined, and as we'll be speaking to here shortly even further, without real private sector leadership, ambition, engagement, direction, and compliance and performance, we can't deliver the transitions that we know are so urgently needed. I'm here as World Business Council for Sustainable Development, as Reddy said, and thank you so much for welcoming us to be here. We are a platform of 230 leading companies, 70 of which are working across food value chains on these types of food issues, be it climate and nature-positive production, regenerative agriculture and farmers at the center, farmer incomes, farmer livelihoods, nutrition, health, and the types of accountability and performance KPIs that are so required to demonstrate accountability for what progress looks like, but also to call out when it's not there. And I think this point about only welcoming leading companies is important. It's wonderful we need that leadership because it's through those global value chains that that we can start to really connect in so many SMEs who are part of this and lift a bit of that burden and support the level of effort that the transition can take through the financing and purchasing and sourcing that goes through those supplies. But by no means is that sufficient, because the SME networks that are really the backbone of delivering food system support and transformation is going to have to be lifted even further. When we came into the first UN Food System Summit in 2021, together with several of you here in the audience, we were able to mobilize over 220 business leaders across all sectors in the food and ag system and of all sizes to sign on to a global business declaration. Thank you. We are now looking to see, of those 6 elements of the business leaders declaration, what have we seen as progress? And in partnership with the World Benchmarking Alliance, we're going to be looking at what that performance and progress might look like. There may be elements in 4 of those that are quantitative that we can see both where we've moved and where challenges certainly remain. And there's 2 that were more qualitative that we need to continue to lean into. For that, we have other mechanisms to look to. One of those is, how is finance flowing, and how are we making progress on moving funds, both private sector and through public-private partnership? With that, we depend very much on the Good Food Finance Network, which was launched here in Rome, together again with many partners who are here in the room, to drive that focus and acceleration and understanding of what it will take to bring finance flow into food systems, not just climate finance, certainly not coming off of the GBF with what nature finance needs to look like, but how do we look at nutritious, secure, productive, valued food systems at the local level up through country level? There's been a number of ways that we've continued through these business partnerships and networks to drive the types of change that are needed. In partnership with the Global Environment Facility, for example, under FOLU 7, looking at what does it take to transform food landscapes, particularly in Southeast Asia. And with over 70 million focused funneled through that into, I think at this point, over 12 countries, we've been able to mobilize with partners how to drive transformation that benefits the mostly smallholder farmers in that food rice landscape with the practices that help them with both water and income and productivity. These are the types of examples that we will continue to lift, and there was over 12 different companies involved in those value chains participating in both the investment, the training, and the offtake. Those are the types of networks that we need to continue to strengthen. There's other ways that we can continue to drive this. And now I come back into, how do we support the country level work and ambition? For us to see the movement of the food pathways at the country level start to really take shape, we know there's more work to do to funnel those connection points to the climate NDCs that the countries have, the MBSAPs that they now have coming off of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and other mechanisms that exist to make elements, critical elements of those food transition pathways mandatory. Moving from voluntary to mandatory at the country level helps drive the compliance requirements that business needs to deliver to ensure that companies can support. There's other ways, though, to continue to mobilize finance in support of those types of mechanisms. The co-investment platform that the Good Food Finance Network is leading is one example. The Forest Investor Club that is led by 2 different countries that brings several million into both forest and agricultural landscapes is yet another very specific example of the ways we need to move this forward. One of the ways that private sector can help, in addition to its sourcing and its public, its value chains and its engagement of all of the partners, is through innovation and technology. That we need to continue to scale as well. And measuring the amount of investment that's going there is something that we will contribute. With that, I will close and just say, continue to count on leading businesses and how we mobilize others who need to accelerate their action to really deliver on the food system transformation ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Diane. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Right. Now we're going to get into an interactive conversation with the different stakeholders. If we all want the same things, then why are we experiencing all these challenges and obstacles towards food systems transformation? In the next few minutes, I will be in conversation with government representatives, agri-food leading companies, SMEs, and development partners. I'm going to start with you, Secretary of State for Germany, Joachim Flassbart. We accept that it is the private sector that is expected to contribute about 50% towards the attainment of SDGs. But the private sector often complains that development partners are very difficult to do business with. Their processes are cumbersome, there are high transaction costs. So my question to you is, how do we ensure that development partners get the incentives and frameworks to create an enabling environment to attract the investments that will take us to our goals?
Thanks a lot, moderator. Hello, everybody. I would say this is a really conservative estimate with 50% around that with private investments in the SDGs. If I look at the situation where we are, the trillions needed, and if I look only at my budget, it is impossible. Forget about it. It is not doable by public investment. That's what I'm saying. So we need the private sector. Even if I were able to convince my Minister of Finance to double or triple or quadruple my budget, it would not be possible. And as Ministers of Finance are genetically all the same around the world, it will simply not happen. So therefore, we need the private sector to come in. So there are three important points. One is we are investing a lot into agriculture and the food system, but we are not doing it always in a sustainable way. So the subsidies around the food and agriculture sector are enormous, and they need to be repurposed. And then we would have at least double, if not triple, wins. We can use the money to invest it in a more sustainable food and agriculture system. We can even use some of the money to do some other things in other areas of the SDGs, like education and so on. So what is needed for the private sector is the enabling environment. That's true, and that has a legal side, where the private sector will only invest if there is legal security. So we have to have a secure legal system. We need to have at least low corruption, if not non-corruption, and then we need to have legal fairness. For example, land titles, especially with regard to women. In many areas of the world, in many regions of the world, we are losing lots of opportunities simply because we are ignoring the capacity of 50% of our population. And these are some of the examples. So my last point on that would be, I want to see the private sector in specifically also in the food system, but not for any price. You can do a lot of horrible things with private investment if they are just focused on short-term maximization of return on investment. So we need to balance it. We need to provide a corridor for private investments, ensuring that they are investing their money in the right direction. Then they are welcomed. It's not to limit the private sector. On the contrary, to get them in, but at the same time to ensure that this is not getting into conflict. And it's very easy to do once we are talking about land. You can do horrible things and unsustainable use of land and water resources. And therefore, my appeal is I advocate for more boldness to regulate. If you don't regulate the food and agriculture sector, then we will not see the investments needed. It seems to be a contradiction, but then we will not see the investment needed because we are then opening a space for an unsustainable world that none of us wishes to see.
Regulation is a swear word where I come from, but it sounds as if you are very optimistic that we can reach middle ground where the private sector is left alone to do its business, but there's a government as a custodian of people.
You know, before I entered the development space, the ministry, I was within my environment throughout the whole time of my life. And we know each other from former biodiversity conferences. And you know, if environmentalists in governments see a problem, they ask, can we prohibit it? Can we forbid it? In development, we ask, what is the bill? How high is the bill? So I think some parts of regulation are not the worst way to get to our targets.
Right. Thank you, Secretary of State. Thank you, Secretary of State. And I must just kindly excuse the Secretary of State. He will miss his flight. You did notice that we started a little late, so he's been very charitable to us and stayed to answer that question in an inspiring way. So thank you for your generosity. Thanks indeed. We'll carry on with our conversation, and on this theme, Masayoshi Mizuno, Director General, Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries in Japan. I have the same question for you about development partners. There are models and frameworks that are challenging, that are cumbersome. How do we change that positively?
Thank you. As Director General of Ministry of Agriculture of Japan, I can confidently say that the Japanese business sectors are increasingly interested in investment in sustainable food systems. Japanese food companies are trying to ensure that they are using the ingredients that are grown environmentally friendly manner. Indeed, some of these companies are allocating a large amount of financial and human resources for that purpose. Yet, there are obstacles to overcome. Major challenges food companies are facing are the limited access to production site far away from Japan. Imported ingredients such as coffee beans and cacao beans are grown in Latin America and Africa. Having imported them regardless of the sustainability of their farming for decades, they are now struggling to get environmentally friendly grown ingredients, and find it difficult for them to make direct contact to farmers in these producing countries. On the side of small-scale farmers in developing countries, we are aware of their concern that they are not sure if they can actually see if companies from rich countries are reliable and cooperative enough to work with. Considering such situation with farmers and food companies in need of direct contact but unable to reach with each other, the government of Japan has launched a new initiative to connect them. It was announced at the occasion of G7 Agriculture Ministerial meeting held in Miyazaki, Japan in April this year. The title of the initiative is ELPS, Enhance the Linkage Between Private Sectors and Small-Scale Producers, and it takes the form of financial contribution from Japanese government to IFAD. Our hope in establishing this ELPS initiative is that IFAD's abundant experience and expertise in assisting small-scale farmers in developing countries will make it easier to encourage farmers into contact with foreign companies. And food companies who are keen in incorporating sustainably grown ingredients can benefit from this initiative, as farmers will be able to grow in more sustainable manner various foods. And actually, these food companies can benefit from this initiative, as these small-scale farmers can provide them with ingredients that meet sustainability requirements.
We'll leave it there for just a moment. Thank you very much for that comprehensive answer. We have pressure of time, but I do want to bring in here former Under-Secretary General, Prime Minister for Guinea, Mohamed Bevogi, and just to touch on something else that the Secretary of State from Germany touched on, that the private sector tends to go where it can make profit. It has to be profitable for them to invest. And in low-income countries in particular, the environment is not conducive for profit, but they cannot be left behind. Evidence is showing us that the bulk of non-developmental finance has been attained through blended financing. What does this mean for low-income countries? How can they be helped with the right incentives and the right frameworks so that they too attract private sector investment, despite some debilitating conditions on the ground?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Indeed, the challenge faced by low-income countries in attracting substantial private sector investment relate to the perception that profitability is low while risk is very high. So several factors contribute to this preference, including political stability, a favorable business environment, limited infrastructure, and skilled workforce. The goal for LICs, therefore, is to create an enabling environment that mitigates these challenges and encourages more private sector investment. Here are several potential incentives and frameworks that could be instituted. And I want to divide this in two groups. Policy and legal frameworks, one group, 5 items, and then frameworks, also 5 items. So, related to policy and legal reforms, you said it yourself, one have to be clear on your own vision and define properly the objectives. This is frequently missing in several LICs countries, particularly those in crisis. Secondly, strengthening domestic resource mobilization and the management of resources. In my village, they say, if you want somebody to wash your back, you have to wash your chest properly yourself. Next is simplifying regulations. Simplifying regulations, improving property rights, ensuring contract enforcement can create a more favorable business environment. Somebody was saying about it just now. Investment protection measures, investment incentive that can take many forms, and so on and so forth. They are known, these are repeated every day, we know more or less. But also, not only policy reforms, but also promoting some specific type of framework helps. One that is frequently used and known is public-private partnership that can effectively attract private sector investment. They feel more secure sometimes when they are working with government locally. Investment-targeted services, providing clear, accessible information. They need frameworks that where the information is available, transparent to everybody. And it is even more useful when that information is built together. Then there is trust in the information. Special economic zone, big push, a big boom on the African continent. Although they need to be streamlined properly, because those type of investment without proper incubation accompanying this does not work properly. So, regional mechanism. If your country is part of a regional mechanism, such as African trade market, definitely you can attract people, because people think that the market is not only limited to your country, but is a market that is much wider. So therefore, there is a big interest into going to that, in addition to other ways. And the last one is something that is being tried. I don't know if some of you participated yesterday in the Nigerian presentation where you had a private sector entity, government, and a donor, which is IFAD, that were trying to develop a program on rice production, which is now has become very successful and very popular, and the government itself would like to put in more resources with private sector to increase, to scale it up. So these are just some of the necessary conditions to attract private sector, but it is also important to have means of implementation that are strong, but also means of monitoring and producing evidence of results. People come to you when they see you are serious, and to show you are serious, you need to have data. You need to show you need to have proper institutions, and you need to be transparent. So those are very, very important. So one aspect that people don't pay too much attention to, particularly in Africa, I will say is non-financial attraction directly. And I'm talking about insurance. See, creating mechanism of insurance are a way of securing people who want to invest in your area. It means that if people feel that they are secure, that if there is a disaster, they are covered, then they will come. Or if there is a disaster, the partner on the ground is covered, then they are encouraged to come. So it is also an aspect, I think, that low-income countries should explore more, and examples are already there. There is the African Risk Capacity promoted by WFP and African Union. That is an example that is now turning into millions with insurance companies. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. Temilolu, I'm coming to you in just a moment, but just to let you know that the interpretation for this session will stop at 5:30. We unfortunately started a little late, so at 5:30 the interpretation will stop, but our session will continue, so I hope you will be fine there. Let's bring you in then, Temilolu Okeowo, General Counsel, Babangona. And our DG from Japan touched on this, the programs that they have for smallholder farmers, and he already introduced the theme of SMEs, which are the new drivers of economic growth, especially in Africa. One of the biggest complaints from the SME sector is that they have no access to formal finance. It is quite a dire situation if you consider that the smallholder farmers constitute the bulk of the global farming community. They are feeding populations, they are keeping economies alive. We had the Food Summit, which concluded recently. I wonder how you feel about it. Do you think that it addressed some of the challenges? What would you like to see happening on the ground?
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me here. You mentioned smallholder farmers accounting for, a large part of the produce. I mean, in Nigeria, where Babangona is based, smallholder farmers, produce 90% of the food that we eat. And that's really why at Babangona, our aim is to make African smallholder farmers richer and more environmentally sustainable. And we do this because we want to stop poverty and violence from threatening Africa's future, which triggers a mass migration to Europe. Over the years, we've been very fortunate and able to support the smallholder farmers within our system to increase their yields and profitability by 2x that of their peers. And in the last 3 years, we've been able to grow 5x. So this has given us the opportunity to support more smallholder farmers. In terms of, incentives and frameworks, that we are using to attract more private capital into the sector. I think I'll touch on 3 things: access, which you mentioned, technology, and financial inclusion. As I said, there are no shortage of farmers in Africa. In Nigeria alone, there are reported to be 38 million smallholder farmers just in Nigeria. A majority of these farmers, operate in rural regions. So, in Nigeria, 70% of people that live in rural areas are smallholder farmers. Most of these farmers farmers live, most of these farmers have, 2 hectares or less of land spread across diverse geographical areas, often hard to reach. They're also unbanked. So at Babangona, that's really where we step in, really to be, the middleman that can bring the farmers to private capital and vice versa. Since we started about a decade ago, we've been able to support 500,000 smallholder farmers with partners from the private sector and from organizations like IFAD and KFW. For us, I think it's also, our onboarding process. We're very big on creating trust within these local communities where we work. And it's that trust, I think, that provides credibility to the sorts of farmers that we onboard. So for example, we've been operating in these regions for years. We know these farmers. We know their families. A lot of our field agents have been to their houses. And so we're also able to provide the private sector with reliable farmers. And it's also another reason why we've been able to maintain repayment rates of 99.9% on average with the farmer loans that we give out. Another thing is technology, and it's probably one of the things that I should have started with because our operations are highly reliant on technology. I think when people think about agri-tech firms, they just focus on the agriculture component of tech. But for us, we've created, over a number of years, a diverse technology platform that's able to support our smallholder farmers across the entire ecosystem. So we have, for example, a logistics technology module that helps us in running very complex two-way supply chains, where we've moved over 30 ocean liners of fertilizer and grains in and out of hundreds of thousands of farmlands over the years that we've been in operation. We also have a financial technology platform, which is what helps us to deploy financing to our smallholder farmers. In the years that we've been in existence, we've used this app to help us deploy over 200 million USD to the farmers that we support. We also have an edutech platform, which we use to train our smallholder farmers and also our employees and the agents that work with us. Also, just to touch on financial inclusion as I round up, this season we've launched what we call the Operator Program, which I'm very passionate about. And the Operator Program goes a step further to make smallholder farmers more independent. So instead of us taking on financing to support these farmers, we're now bringing private capital directly to these farmers so that farmers can get loans on their balance sheets directly. As you can imagine, it is a huge task. In addition to having to set up legal entities for hundreds of thousands of farmers. We've also had to assist them in opening bank accounts, getting tax identification numbers, and also educating them on the importance of having these things in order to build their own credit history. So those are some of the things that we've been doing at Babangona. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Temiloloa. Let me bring you in here, Geraldine. So we've heard how development agencies are expanding private sector windows and instruments that would enable and help the private sector to really optimize investments at scale so that we achieve food systems transformation. I mean, is this something that then will bring capital forward? Is it helpful? What are your thoughts?
Absolutely, and
with particular focus on low-income countries, I beg your pardon.
That is fine. And you have a terrible job here of trying to keep us within a time that is about. So I'm going to try and keep it to 3 minutes. Firstly, I'm highly inspired by what I'm hearing. And thank you very much for the summit itself and for the journey from 2021 to today. Because to answer your question, there is so much that's going on that's extremely encouraging and is going to help in bringing capital to where it's needed. And I would underpin that in 2 reasons. Firstly, if we don't know what we all are trying to achieve, it's very difficult to align interests. And yesterday I was listening to the developments on the food system transformation measuring framework. If we all agree what we want to measure, where the baseline is, then we for sure will be much better at aligning our interests and aligning our resources and our ambitions. And I'll come back on dreams as well, in my view. Secondly, what is extremely helpful as well for the private sector is the ability to go from big global ideas to country strategies. Because let's be clear, when it comes to the food system, every country is different. And DSM-Firmenich, we are the company in the world that is about the science, the innovation, and the reach of micronutrients. And you know what? The picture is so different. In some places, it's all about micronutrient deficiency, not enough food, hunger, etc., stunting. And other parts of the world, it's simply wrong diets leading to terrible healthcare outcomes. So excellent, really helpful, and really the journey is very encouraging. If you allow me to call out two very specific things, though, it appears that there has been maybe more progress on looking at producing food, and it's not surprising in the context of the Ukraine war, and in our top of mind, it's food resilience, access to food, affordability of food, for sure. However, the true value of food comes from healthy people, and healthy people comes from nutrition, per se. So some way, somehow, retaining this very close link between food systems and outcomes. So healthy people, healthy planet, healthy livelihoods, nutrition is really key. And I can't sit here and not call out the fact that it is now very clear that large-scale fortification is a no-brainer when it comes to public health outcomes, that school feeding programs, you mentioned them in your introduction, are a no-brainer when it comes to outcomes. So nutrition, nutrition, nutrition. And maybe just to round off, and you mentioned public-private partnerships. And my message is, yes, they work. And we've got a fantastic example. So Your Excellency, thank you for bringing it up. Once upon a time, there was a dream. Could we make in Africa, for Africa, relief food, Super Cereal Plus? And I am looking at some of our partners in this journey in this room. By bringing together the government of Rwanda, by bringing together IFC, FMO, and I have to say, the World Food Programme, we were able to, with the private sector, put very serious money behind producing at scale the relief food for mostly, East Africa, the Horn of Africa. What does it take? It takes a common dream, and I touched upon it earlier. It takes trust. If there isn't trust between parties that we all mean it, then it can't work. Mm-hmm. It takes capital, and we talked about money. It takes money, but also skills. It's not only about money, it's about combining our skills. But last and not least, it takes commitment, determination, and a stable environment. So these things take time. We started in 2016. Today, Africa Improved Foods, which is the company, the joint venture that was created, is working flat out to try and save lives, and is saving 1.6 million lives. Outcome number one. It is sustaining the livelihood of 60,000 smallholder farmers because the sourcing is in the continent, in the neighboring countries. And it has actually brought to the economy, the local economy, 1 billion in incremental gains. So this is development, it is food system transformation, and importantly, it is PPP live. So the future is, we want to replicate this at scale because we need the impact. There you go.
Geraldine is so good. Every time I'm about to interrupt her, she goes, importantly. Importantly. So well done there. But Lawrence, I'd like to introduce you to the conversation. Lawrence Haddad, Executive Director at Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. Geraldine, you touched on this. I can't believe, Lawrence, that we're still debating the urgency and need for nutritious food. I mean, why are we even here? I shared that frightening statistic from the Global Index data that almost 70% of the largest manufacturers do not meet the healthy standards. Conversations around sugar and salt, obesity, poor health outcomes that are bad for profit, that are bad for our economies. So how do we keep the private sector accountable here?
Thanks, Reddy. Importantly, no, I will use that relentlessly. Look, it's not just the private sector we have to keep accountable. Governments, all of us need to be accountable. GAIN needs to be accountable, right? Everyone needs to be accountable. However, and by the way, a really good example of a government accountability mechanism, I'm looking at these guys over here, is the IFAD World Bank 3FS initiative. I hope you saw it yesterday. It maps government and donor budgets to food systems. It's extraordinary, and we need something like that now for the private sector. It needs to move into that space. So private sector accountability is really important, obviously, because the private sector is a massive engine for food systems, for good and for bad. And we need to make it more good and less bad. But private sector accountability is also a massive challenge because so much of the data and the information is proprietary. So it's really important that we don't just monitor commitments, public commitments, we monitor everything that companies do. And we, ATNI and WBA are brilliant at that, so in the nutrition and sustainability space. That's my first point. Second point is we need to make it easy and attractive for businesses to engage with accountability mechanisms. It helps if there is a scientific consensus to which easily says, if you're doing this as a business, it's a good thing for hunger or malnutrition or for climates. That scientific basis is really important. Something we developed at the Food System Summit 2 years ago, which has really taken off, is a Zero Hunger private sector pledge. We had 260 million pledged at the summit, and then we had another 300 million pledged since the summit. We've had 50 million pledged at this +2 meeting. So, but it's underpinned by a scientific consensus that makes it easy for us and the company to say, this is unequivocally a good thing. We need to make sure that companies are not filling out 5 or 6 or 7 templates that are all duplicative. This gives companies a reason, actually quite validly, to say, I'm not doing all this stuff, I'm not doing it all over again 5 or 6 times. You figure it out and make sure I only have to do it once. If we don't rationalize, we are giving them an excuse not to comply. And I think the other thing to make it attractive, especially for SMEs, is the learning aspect. And GAIN has worked with the Sun Business Network to develop the Nutrition Business Monitor, which allows SMEs to self-assess with how nutritious they are, and it really gives them, holds up a mirror to what they can do better or worse. Next point is we need to make sure accountabilities map across the different outcomes. I've talked mostly about nutrition, and Geraldine, thank you for emphasizing that. But of course, there are accountabilities across livelihoods, environment, resilience, and so on. We, as a part of the ICANN initiative, which was launched at COP27, GAIN and the government of Egypt are the co-chairs, FAO and WHO and SUN are deeply involved. One of the indicators we're tracking for the integration of climate and sustainability in nutrition is the WBA 350 company indicator set. So we said, how many of these 350 companies score high on sustainability and high on nutrition? 0. Put that in your Mentimeter. And then finally, how do we make commitments inclusive? We need to design, we can be really intentional about this. We need to design private sector finance mechanisms so they reach the poorest, so they reach the most excluded, those most vulnerable to stress like climate change. The nutritious food financing facility that we have developed with Incofin and a number of other partners in this room is targeting small and medium enterprises that are led by women, that have a good business case, that deliver nutritious food that's climate sensitive and climate smart for domestic consumption. So it's very intentional, it can be done. We can be intentional about inclusivity of private sector commitments, and indeed we must.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. Thank you. Catherine Pickers, Senior Vice President of Sustainability and Impact at Tyson's. We won't repeat the statistics, we've heard them, they are sobering. So the question is, can we continue to rely on voluntary commitments from a few for the transformation that we want? Do we need to move to mandatory standards and norms for food businesses to see a change at scale?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. You know, I think that what we are all looking for, and Lawrence, I love your comment about standardizing the kind of reporting that we do. If someone in my position, sitting in the role of head of sustainability for a company, what we are trying to do is improve our ESG and sustainability performance and continue to contribute to external data and information so that people have an understanding that they can trust us. And it comes back to that point of trust. And Victoria, I'm working on your benchmark right now. And what these benchmarks do, they come from investors, they come from customers, they're coming from NGOs, and they're giving us an indication as to where we should be headed. Now, clearly, across our long-range strategy that we're rolling out in our next sustainability report, we have priorities. That materiality assessment that is coming back to us helps us form a roadmap. And one of the most key initiatives that we have is about partnerships. And Diane Holder from WBCSD, we couldn't do this work without you all. And we can't do it without our commercial partners like DSM and our NGO partners. One of our key priorities that we're looking to address comes from how do we manage the emissions from our value chain. The Scope 3, this is looking upstream in our value chain, saying we need to act urgently and in partnership with others. We didn't start working on our own as just a company. We reached out to NGOs, the Environmental Defense Fund, the Nature Conservancy, pulled in, an accounting firm to look over our shoulder to make sure that we are getting our calculations right, to hold us to account from the very beginning. And these partnerships, as we start to think about managing emissions from row crops and also from our ranchers and poultry farmers, we want to make sure that we have scientific-based measurements that help us report externally so that people can, again, trust our actions and want to partner with us. One of the things that we started just a year and a half ago as we started working on our value chain initiative, the USDA, coming from government, the Biden administration said, look, we understand through the IRA of 2022 that we have a role in contributing to the shift that needs to happen within the system. Not only will we stop there, and I have to say, and Victoria, I think to your point about acceleration, the money that is passing through us to our farmers from the USDA will help us accelerate that change and transformation within the sector. It's critical. But going back to what I think the work of Earther and Cousin and the Food Systems for the Future is doing is that they know that we can't, government, business, NGOs, the multinationals, or multilaterals, we need the investment community. We need them to come up and really shape the marketplace so they can do their thing and help drive change across the system. So, very short, that's kind of what we need to do to make things happen.
Thank you so much. Let me thank my panelists. This part of our conversation is over, and I know one or two of you have other engagements to which you need to rush. It is okay, you are excused if you need to go, but at the same time, I'd like to invite Greg Garrett, Executive Director, ATNI, Action on Nutrition Initiative, and Shalini Unikrishnan to talk to us from the lectern. Thank you very much.
Well, good evening now. It's a pleasure to be able to address all of you with some exciting initiatives that are related to private sector. I'm representing an organization that's working with some of the largest food manufacturers in the world, as well as national companies that are producing the foods that we see on the shelves around the world at food retail. The good news is initiatives are being taken, and I'll explain it in a moment. The bad news is processed foods, by and large, as we know, are unhealthy, and 70% of processed foods are measured as unhealthy. Too much salt, too much sugar, too much fat, and often far too micronutrients. Sorry about the mic.
I think use this one. They're both on. That's why there's feedback, I think. Okay.
Great. So 40,000 products representing about 30% of the world's processed foods are being measured on a regular basis by Access to Nutrition Initiative. The good news is companies are lining up. Investors, the shareholders of these companies, are lining up to say we need a metric by which we can define if those foods are healthy, and we need to hold companies to account. And the companies themselves are saying we're agreeing to this. We're working with the Rockefeller Foundation on a CEO initiative on healthy and sustainable diets by 2030, which will measure every 2 years the healthiness of product portfolios of the world's largest food companies, and work with CEO level, board level commitments to improve the healthiness score, and also make sure companies are not marketing unhealthy food to children, which is ongoing, unfortunately, and they're committing to better pricing of nutritious foods. So we're looking to launch this with the Rockefeller Foundation, with the CEOs, and with shareholders of those companies later this year. We're very excited about what it means for grocery stores around the world, retail, including in low and middle income countries. Thank you.
Evening, everyone. I'm Shalini Unikrishnan with the Boston Consulting Group. I'm here to share one example of the exciting agenda that's shaping up at COP28 this year. Many of you may have heard Her Excellency Maryam Al-Mari speak yesterday in the plenary to how food is a top priority topic for the COP28 presidency. We also have a lot of energy in the private sector to move beyond commitments to implementation and implementation at scale. We're really excited to bring those two things together under a flagship initiative under the leadership of the COP28 presidency. This initiative is called the COP28 to 30 Regenerative Landscape Action Agenda. It's chaired by the high-level champions, WBCSD and BCG, and brings together already 15+ CEOs with finance, with farmers, with local government and multi-stakeholder perspectives to really work on how to accelerate impact and action at scale. And there is a reason why we have chosen to focus on regenerative landscapes, given the potential for impact on economic, social, and environmental outcomes, and the potential for impact at scale with a landscape focus. This is not a new coalition. We are not trying to redo the work that is already happening. We're looking to aggregate and accelerate. We're looking to build on existing platforms like Regen 10 and really drive collaboration and action on this agenda. There is a lot more brewing up and a lot more to come, and you'll hear more from us during UN Climate Week, and looking forward to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. A big thank you, Greg and Shalini. We've come to the end of our proceedings today, but just to wrap it up for us and give us an idea of their vision to move the private sector agenda forward as co-leads of financing agenda for food systems transformation, I'd like to invite Jyotsna Puri, IFAD Associate Vice President, and Martin van Nieuwkoop, Global Director for the Agriculture and Food Global Practice World Bank.
Thank you so much, Rebbe, and such a pleasure to be here. So I have the thankless task of trying to give you my remarks in all of 2 minutes. And what I will do is focus on two things that the panel spoke about. One was the incentives. What are the incentives that we have in place so that the private sector can truly come in? And the second one is accountability. And clearly, we've got to work at the intersection of those two areas. What we're doing at IFAD is really bringing accountability and incentives together. So we have a large private sector program, and we are really positioning ourselves, and have been over the past 15 years, in this area of looking at private sector financing, providing those incentives, and really blending it in a way that is catalytic, but is also sustainable and scalable for the public sector as well as the private sector in our country programs. So we've got a portfolio of approximately $9.5 billion, if you include international co-financing and domestic co-financing. And what we do there is really recognize that there is a diversity of risks that are available and appetites that are available amongst countries, donor partners, but also the private sector. And it is possible to bring all of those together in aggregate platforms where we are able to speak to different organizations and stakeholders' risk appetite, but blend it together. And that's what makes, I think, in my view, IFAD very special, because we are able to interact with the smallholder farmer. And remember, what the panel said was 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 of the overall emissions come from food systems. 1/3 of the food that we consume actually gets lost or wasted. But 1/3 is really the food that we eat comes from smallholder farmers, and that's the amount that we need to invest in. But the overall amount of climate finance that goes to that space is just 3%. So we've got to change that, and we are catalyzing it. I think the WBA report is really the part that we've got to focus on for accountability. And that's my last remark here, Rebbe, but I do want to importantly say that, which is that we've seen the 2021 report really spoke about how less than 10% of the companies are Paris aligned. We saw that 80% of the companies did not meet nutrition targets and human rights targets. And yes, in 2023, there is an engagement and an improvement in at least the awareness levels that we are seeing. But that's not enough. And we've got to go the last mile. And really, in providing those incentives with blended finance and bringing together the credibility structures is where IFAD is positioning itself as well. Thank you very much.
Very good. I fully agree with what Puri said. I just want to add a few things, very short. I think we heard very clearly that there are two problems when it comes to private sector investment in agriculture and food. I mean, one is that because the agriculture sector is a risky sector, and increasingly so because of climate change, the level of investments is not enough, I mean, for the change that we're looking for. And second, you know, there's a big problem with the quality of private sector investments. And I think we heard it very well from the presentation from Victoria, from the World Benchmarking Alliance. So the solution actually is very, very simple. And I would actually recommend, we are recommending that all countries that are looking at implementation pathways actually look for opportunities to include a compact between the public sector and the private sector, under which part of the current public support to agriculture, which is huge, about $800 billion, is being repurposed, I mean, to de-risk private sector investments for greening supply chain and making supply chains more inclusive. And in return, the private sector that actually benefits from those de-risking arrangements actually raise their ESG standards in line with the recommendations of the World Benchmarking Alliance. If every implementation pathway would include a compact like that, I think it would really make a difference on the ground and reflect the discussion that we had today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have now really come to the end of our session. I hope that you are sufficiently inspired, sufficiently challenged. If we don't act to achieve food systems transformation, then our well-being as the human race is at stake. Thank you so much.
Thanks for organizing all of us.
E. c'è Ronza, cioè qui c'è solo